He was just fixing an old fence on his ranch when his shovel hit something solid. One strike, and the ground revealed a secret no one was ever meant to see. What he dug up changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the Texas plains, brushing the horizon with muted gold. The sky was pale, the kind of dusty color that always preceded a day of merciless heat. The land stretched in silence, a patchwork of cracked earth, dry grass, and faded fences leaning tiredly in the wind. Somewhere, far off, a coyote called and was answered only by the faint rattle of the windmill blades turning lazily against the empty sky. Marcus Hale stood beside his weathered pickup, the door open, his work gloves tucked into his belt. The morning air carried the faint chill that would soon vanish under the weight of the sun. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his skin the deep brown of a man who had spent his life under open skies. Sweat already dampened the collar of his shirt, though the sun had barely risen. He sipped from a tin cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and stared out across the land that had once seemed endless to him as a boy. Now it just felt heavy, too big, too tired, and too full of memories that wouldn't let go. The Hale Ranch had stood for generations, carved out of the prairie long before Marcus was born. His grandfather, Joseph Hale, had built the first fences with his own hands, splitting cedar posts under a sun just as cruel as this one. His father had kept the ranch alive through droughts, floods, and debt, and now it was Marcus's turn to bear the burden. He had always thought the land would take care of him the way it had taken care of them, but lately it felt more like he was the one keeping it alive. The drought had been brutal. The soil cracked open like old skin. The streams had long since dried into faint scars in the dirt, and the cattle grew thinner by the week. The bank had called twice this month already. He had sold 2 of his best horses to keep the lights on and had started working odd jobs for other ranchers, fixing gates, welding water tanks, anything that paid enough to hold off another bill. Every evening he came home and sat on the porch, listening to the insects hum in the dusk, thinking how strange it was to inherit so much and yet have so little left to give. Still, he couldn't leave. Every inch of the ranch was soaked with his family's history. Beneath the mesquite trees were the stones marking where his grandparents were buried. The old barn still smelled faintly of the hay his father had baled decades ago. He could still picture himself as a child running barefoot through the tall grass, chasing after his father's dog while his mother called him in for supper. The land had always been their pride, their curse, and their story. That morning, he decided to work the north fence line. It hadn't been touched in years, not since before his father passed. The wire was rusted, the posts leaning, some nearly swallowed by the earth. If he was going to sell the far edge of the property to ease the debt, it needed to look decent. He loaded the truck with new posts, a sledgehammer, a spool of wire, and his shovel. The old truck groaned as it rolled down the dirt road, leaving behind a trail of dust that hung in the still air. The drive took him across miles of open pasture. The grass was short and brittle, crunching under the tires. A few cows grazed lazily near the creek bed, though there was no water left there, just smooth stones and dry mud. Marcus kept glancing toward the horizon, half expecting rain clouds that never came. Every now and then, he thought he could hear the faint whisper of his grandfather's voice in his head, the way he used to speak when teaching him how to plant fence posts straight. "This land remembers, boy," he'd say. "Everything you do to it, it keeps." He reached the northern boundary by mid-morning. The air shimmered with heat, though the sun was still climbing. He parked by the old oak that marked the property corner, killed the engine, and stepped out. The silence was so deep it seemed alive. Even the cicadas were quiet. He took a slow breath, tasting dust and iron on his tongue, and started unloading his tools. The first few posts came up easily. The old ones were rotten through, their bases crumbling like ash. He pulled them out, dug new holes, tamped the soil, and set the replacements. It was hard, lonely work, the kind of labor that left no room for thought. Sweat ran down his temples and soaked into the band of his hat. The rhythmic thud of the shovel, the clank of the hammer, the creak of wire, all of it became a kind of meditation. By noon, the sun was a white disk overhead. Marcus leaned on the handle of his shovel and wiped his brow. He took a sip from his thermos and squinted across the field. In the distance, the heat distorted everything, making the horizon shimmer like water. For a moment, he imagined his grandfather standing there by the fence, tall and proud, with that steady look in his eyes, the same one Marcus had inherited but never felt worthy of. He sighed and went back to work. The ground was harder here, packed tight from decades of heat. Each strike of the shovel sent vibrations up his arms. When he reached the corner section, one post caught his attention. It was older than the others, thicker, the wood blackened at the base. He remembered his father mentioning that part of the fence once marked the boundary between their land and the old Whiteley Ranch, the one that had been abandoned after the family sold out and moved north. The post leaned slightly, almost swallowed by dirt. Marcus knelt, wedged the shovel under it, and pressed down. The wood creaked but didn't move. He tried again, digging deeper, breaking up the soil. That was when he heard it, the dull clang of metal striking something solid. He paused, frowning, then tried again. The sound came again, deeper this time, more hollow than stone. He crouched lower, brushed away the loose dirt with his gloved hands. The soil was dry and crumbly, falling away easily. Soon, a faint curve of something pale emerged beneath the surface. Marcus froze. For a moment, he thought it was a rock, but the shape was too smooth, too deliberate. He scraped gently, revealing more. His stomach tightened as the white surface took on the unmistakable curve of a human bone. The air seemed to still around him. The only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. He sat back on his heels, staring at the ground, his breath shallow. 100 thoughts ran through his head. Animal remains, maybe, or something buried by mistake decades ago. But the longer he looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't an animal. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He reached for the shovel again, widening the hole carefully, working around the edges. The more he dug, the more of it appeared. A rib, a shoulder blade, fragments of cloth so old they fell apart at his touch. And then, gleaming faintly among the dirt, a sliver of metal. Marcus lifted it out slowly. It was small, oval-shaped, pitted with rust but still recognizable, a badge. The letters were faint, but he could make out the outline of a star and the worn imprint of words that chilled him even in the heat. County Sheriff. He stared at it, his hands trembling. The badge felt strangely heavy, as if it carried more than metal. A memory stirred, his grandmother's voice soft but firm, telling him stories about the man he was named after. Joseph Hale, the county sheriff who vanished one night and was never found. He had been a man of integrity, she'd said, a man who stood against the wrong kind of power. But people stopped talking about him after a while. Too dangerous, too painful. Marcus sat there for a long time, the badge in his hand, the earth open before him. The land around him seemed to hum with silence, as though holding its breath. He finally rose, brushed the dirt from his knees, and took a slow step back. His pulse was loud in his ears. He didn't need to think long. His first instinct was clear. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed the sheriff's office. His voice came out quieter than he expected, steady but tinged with disbelief as he explained what he had found. They told him to stay where he was, not to touch anything. Help was on the way. As he ended the call, Marcus stood motionless, looking down at the disturbed soil. The breeze lifted faint strands of dust, swirling them lazily around his boots. The sun blazed higher, turning the world into a white haze. He could smell the faint scent of metal and dry earth, sharp and ancient. For the first time in his life, he felt that the ranch, his family's land, was not just his to keep. It was something that had been waiting. The distant hum of an approaching vehicle broke the silence, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground, on the story that had just begun to surface. The land had finally decided to speak, and he had been the one to strike the first blow. He didn't yet know that this moment, under the relentless Texas sun, would be the hinge of everything. That what lay buried beneath his feet would unravel 50 years of silence, injustice, and pain. For now, there was only the stillness, the open field, and the weight of the past pressing through the soil. The wind moved gently through the fence line, making the old posts creak like voices from another time. When the first police car appeared in the distance, its lights flickering faintly through the heat, Marcus didn't move. He only whispered, almost to himself, "Grandpa, is that you?" The words were lost in the wind. The land gave no answer, but somewhere beneath him, under layers of dust and time, the truth was stirring, ready to rise. The late morning sun had already climbed high enough to bleach the color out of everything. The air shimmered above the ground, the sky stretched wide and cloudless, and the hum of insects had become a dull, constant note that settled deep into the bones. Marcus Hale stood beside the marked-off area of his land, the faint metallic taste of adrenaline still on his tongue. The patrol cars idled in the distance, their engines ticking softly, the men inside talking in low voices. Dust floated through the air like smoke. It didn't seem real. Just hours ago, this patch of dirt had been nothing more than another piece of his worn-out ranch. A line of fence posts, sun-scorched grass, and the smell of iron and dust. Now it was a crime scene. The sheriff, a man Marcus had known since high school, stood beside him, boots planted in the dirt, hat pulled low. He didn't say much, just nodded toward the ground where the deputies were still working. They'd set up small orange flags around the area, little markers in a pattern that made the scene look like a map of something buried long ago. One of the younger officers was bent over the hole Marcus had dug, gently brushing at the exposed bones with a small tool. Another took photographs, the click of the camera echoing unnaturally against the quiet. When they'd first arrived, Marcus had tried to speak, to explain how it happened, how he was just fixing the fence and heard that strange hollow sound, but the words felt useless. The truth was simple and heavy. He hadn't been looking for anything. The earth had chosen to give something up, and he'd only been the one standing there when it did. He stayed silent now, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the disturbed soil. Every movement around him felt slow, deliberate. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something else to rise from the ground. After what felt like hours, the sheriff stepped closer and knelt beside the excavation site. One of the technicians handed him the rusted badge Marcus had found. The sheriff turned it over in his gloved hand, his brows furrowing as he read what was left of the engraving. Then he looked up, his expression unreadable. "This was found with the remains?" he asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "Right where I was digging. Looked like a shoulder, maybe. It was just there." The sheriff didn't answer at first. He rubbed the badge with his thumb, then held it out so the sunlight caught the faint lettering. "This ain't just a badge," he said finally. "This looks like it belonged to someone from the old department. Could be decades old." Something in his tone made Marcus uneasy. He looked down at the piece of metal again, the five-pointed star faint but still visible. Then he saw it. Letters beneath the rust, half buried but clear enough to make his stomach twist. Hale, County Sheriff. For a moment, he couldn't move. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on him. His grandfather's name, his family's name, the one no one had spoken in years except in whispers and fragments. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell when he was a boy, sitting by the stove late at night. Stories about Joseph Hale, the man who had once worn a badge with pride, who stood up for what was right even when it made enemies. A man who'd gone missing one night after investigating something too dangerous, too deep. She never said more than that. No one did. Marcus swallowed hard. The sheriff was saying something, but the words came through like they were underwater. All he could see was the badge glinting faintly in the sun, the dirt-stained letters spelling out his bloodline. They worked through the afternoon, carefully unearthing the rest of the remains. The bones were old, fragile, stained dark from decades beneath the soil. Bits of decayed fabric clung to them so brittle they turned to dust when touched. The deputies laid each piece in a marked container, their movements solemn, as though they understood the weight of what they were disturbing. As they dug deeper, one of them called out. He'd found something else. A small, sealed tin box wedged into the earth beside the skeleton. The box was about the size of a shoebox, its surface corroded and streaked with rust. The sheriff ordered it to be photographed before anyone touched it. Then he crouched beside it and pried it loose with the edge of his knife. The seal cracked with a faint hiss, the smell of age and earth rising into the air. Inside was a collection of small objects preserved as though someone had packed them away carefully. A child's wooden horse carved by hand. A folded piece of paper, yellowed and delicate, and a photograph. The sheriff lifted it carefully by the edges, brushing away bits of dirt. The picture was faded, but the image was clear enough to see. A little boy standing in front of a barn, holding the same carved horse now lying in the box. The child had a round face, dark eyes, and a smile that looked hauntingly familiar. On the back of the photo, written in neat cursive, were the words, "To my son, whom I will find, even if it takes 100 years." Marcus felt the ground tilt beneath him. He didn't need anyone to tell him who the boy was. He'd seen that same face in old albums on the mantel of his mother's house, frozen in black and white. It was his father. He turned away, pressing a hand to his mouth. The air felt too thin. He could hear the officers murmuring, the clicking of the camera, the metallic scrape of tools against earth, but it all felt distant, like he was hearing it through a wall of water. He walked toward the fence line and stood with his back to them, staring at the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip, throwing long shadows across the field. In the fading light, the land looked different, older, almost haunted. It was as if the ghosts of his family had been waiting beneath the soil, patient and silent, until someone finally remembered to look. When the sheriff came over, he didn't ask questions right away. He just stood beside Marcus for a moment, his hat in his hand. Finally, he said softly, "You know, your grandfather's name still sits in the old records. We never had closure on what happened to him. Folks said he left town, others said he got caught up in something dangerous. Guess now we know where he ended up." Marcus nodded slowly. "He didn't leave," he said, his voice rough. "He was left here." The sheriff sighed. "Maybe so. We'll take everything to the lab in Dallas. They'll run tests, confirm what we can. You might be hearing from them in a few weeks." He wanted to ask 100 questions. Who did this? Why? What had his grandfather been investigating? But he could barely speak. All he could do was watch as they packed up the remains, the badge, the box. Each item sealed and labeled, another piece of the puzzle taken away from the land that had hidden it for so long. By the time they left, the sky had turned the color of burnt copper. The ranch was quiet again, except for the faint creak of the windmill and the call of a distant bird. Marcus stood alone beside the open hole. The ground looked raw, like a wound cut open after decades of healing over. He crouched, scooped up a handful of soil, and let it sift through his fingers. It fell like ash. He thought about his grandfather, the man no one talked about, the man who had worn the badge, now resting in an evidence bag. What had he discovered that got him buried out here like a secret? Why had his father, then just a boy, been left with only a note, a promise scratched on the back of a photograph? The night came slow and heavy. Marcus finally made his way back to the house, but sleep didn't come. He sat by the window, the lamplight flickering across the wooden floor, staring out at the dark outline of the field. The land looked peaceful again, the same as always, but he knew better now. Beneath that stillness was something deeper, something that had been calling out through generations, waiting for someone to listen. He remembered his grandfather's reputation, the stories that had survived in fragments. Joseph Hale had been known as an honest man in a dishonest time. Some said he'd stood up to the wrong people, that he'd tried to expose something powerful and paid the price. Others said he'd run away, shamed or afraid. But Marcus's grandmother had always said one thing: "Your granddaddy never ran from truth. Truth ran from him." As he sat there, the weight of that phrase pressed against his chest. He thought of the badge, the bones, the small carved horse that must have once belonged to his father as a child. Somehow it all fit together, though he couldn't yet see how. There was a thread running through it, invisible but strong, binding generations together across time and silence. When dawn finally came, Marcus went back to the side. The earth was cool, damp with morning dew. He stood at the edge of the filled-in hole where the deputies had laid a tarp and marked it with stakes. The grass around it was flattened, the color drained. He felt as if the ground itself were watching him. He took off his hat and bowed his head, not out of habit or faith, but out of something deeper, a quiet understanding that this land, this piece of earth, had chosen him. It had buried one Hale and revealed itself to another. The line hadn't been broken after all. It had just been waiting to be mended. He whispered into the morning air, not expecting an answer. "I'll find out, Grandpa. Whatever they did to you, whatever you were trying to do, I'll finish it." The wind stirred gently through the grass, carrying with it the dry scent of mesquite and soil. It was no answer, but it felt like acknowledgement. The land had spoken once. It would speak again. Marcus turned towards the house, his step slow but certain. Behind him, the horizon glowed with the promise of another relentless Texas day. Ahead of him, unseen and buried deep, the past waited patiently for him to dig further. The following days unfolded in a haze that Marcus could barely distinguish from one another. The rhythm of the ranch, usually so steady and grounding, had been replaced by the strange, disorienting pulse of investigation. Each morning brought more cars up the dirt road, sedans with government plates, vans full of forensic equipment, strangers in gloves and masks stepping across the soil he'd once thought of as sacred. The hum of generators replaced the chirping of grasshoppers, and the faint metallic scent of the disturbed earth never left the air. He stayed on the edge of it all, watching. Sometimes one of the agents would ask him a question about the land, about where the old fence lines ran, or what buildings used to stand where. His answers came automatically, though his thoughts were always elsewhere. The sight of the soil peeled open still haunted him. He couldn't stop thinking about the badge. He'd held it for only a moment before the sheriff had taken it away, but the image of the name, his name, engraved into rust had burned itself into his mind. It felt less like an object found and more like a message sent across time, a voice rising from beneath generations of silence. By the end of the week, the remains had been transported to Dallas for examination. The sheriff stopped by one evening to update him, his truck headlights cutting through the twilight as dust swirled in long ribbons behind him. He told Marcus the lab would run DNA tests, but they were already sure. The age of the bones, the badge, the few scraps of clothing, all of it pointed to one man, Joseph Hale, his grandfather. The news settled like a weight Marcus didn't know how to hold. The confirmation didn't bring relief, it only deepened the sense of mystery. Now that he knew who was buried there, he was consumed by the question of why. That night, unable to sleep, he went into the small room that had once been his father's study. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Shelves lined with worn books, agriculture guides, ledgers, weather records, stood untouched for years. He lit the old desk lamp and began to search through drawers that hadn't been opened in decades. Most held only bills and receipts, the detritus of a farmer's life, but one drawer stuck slightly when he pulled it. Inside, under a stack of faded envelopes, he found a photograph. It was the same one from the box found near the grave, the same boy, the same carved wooden horse in his hands. But this one was intact, uncrumpled, framed neatly behind glass. His father must have kept it all his life. On the back, written in the same looping script, were the words again, "To my son, whom I will find, even if it takes 100 years." Marcus stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters with his thumb. It wasn't just a father's promise, it was a plea, one that had crossed the decades to reach him. The next morning, he drove into town to speak with the sheriff. The man was sitting behind his cluttered desk, flipping through reports. His face looked tired, his voice measured. He told Marcus that the case had already drawn attention from higher up. The state investigators were involved now, and possibly even the FBI. There were patterns in the evidence, things that matched old missing persons cases from the 1970s, some that had never been solved. Most of the victims were black farmers or ranch workers who'd owned small parcels of land that, over the years, had ended up absorbed by the Whiteley family holdings. Marcus knew the name well. The Whiteley Ranch bordered his property to the east, vast spread of land with pristine fences, gleaming barns, and a white mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from another century. Growing up, he'd heard stories about them, how the old man, Thomas Whiteley Sr., had made his fortune buying up land from struggling families, offering prices too low to be fair, but too high for the desperate to refuse. There had always been rumors of threats, of mysterious fires and disappearances, but nothing that ever stuck. The Whiteleys had money, connections, and the kind of confidence that came from generations of untouchable power. The sheriff hesitated before continuing. He told Marcus that one of the documents found buried near his grandfather's remains, a half-decayed page torn from a notebook, contained names and dates along with the faded outline of a hand-drawn star. The star, they believed, represented a map. The points matched the locations of properties once owned by black families in the county, nearly all of which had been sold or seized by the Whiteleys around the time Joseph Hale disappeared. The implication was clear. His grandfather had been investigating something that connected land, power, and death. When Marcus left the office, the streets of the small town felt different. He noticed the way people looked at him, some with curiosity, others with caution. The story had spread faster than the sheriff expected. Hale bones found on Hale land was already being whispered at gas stations and diners. Old faces that had once greeted him with nods now avoided his eyes. He drove home in silence, the road stretching endlessly through the flat, sun-baked landscape. The radio stayed off. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the whisper of wind through the open window. When he reached the ranch, the air felt heavier, as though the land itself were watching him. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. It wasn't much, just thunder low in the distance, flashes of heat lightning, but the air changed. The smell of rain clung to the wind. Marcus sat on the porch, the photograph resting in his lap, and thought about the line that ran through his family. His grandfather, the lawman who disappeared. His father, the boy in the picture who'd grown up silent and bitter, carrying a sadness he never explained. And now, him, standing at the crossroads of their ghosts. He couldn't escape the feeling that his grandfather had left the photo on purpose, buried with his body, waiting for someone in the family to find it. It wasn't just coincidence that the old fence had finally given way, that the drought had thinned the soil, that his shovel had struck exactly where it did. It was as though the land itself had chosen its moment. The next day, he met with the sheriff again. This time, there were two men in suits waiting in the office, state investigators. They introduced themselves politely, but wasted no time. They asked him about his grandfather's reputation, whether Joseph Hale had any known enemies, whether there had been disputes between the Hales and the Whiteley family. Marcus told them what little he knew, that his grandfather had been respected, even by those who feared him, that his disappearance had always been treated as a mystery no one wanted to solve, that the Whiteleys had always seemed to prosper no matter what happened around them. The agents nodded, taking notes. Then one of them, a younger man with sharp eyes, slid a photograph across the desk. It was an old aerial image of the Hale property, taken sometime in the early 1970s. In the upper corner, near the northern fence line, there was a faint structure visible, a small building, half buried, almost erased by time. "Do you know what this is?" the man asked. Marcus leaned in. The photo was grainy, but he recognized the shape. "That used to be a tool shed," he said. "My father told me it was torn down before I was born. Said my grandfather used to spend time there alone." The younger agent exchanged a look with the older one. "We think it might have been more than that," he said quietly. "We found references in your grandfather's notes to something called the room below. We believe he was keeping records there, maybe even evidence." Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine. He'd walked that stretch of land 100 times. The idea that something might still be there, waiting, buried just beneath the surface, made the air around him seem thinner. That night, after the agents left, he couldn't shake the thought. The storm clouds from the previous night had moved on, leaving the air thick and humid. The moon hung low and bright over the fields. He took a flashlight and walked out to the northern boundary, his boots crunching softly against the dry earth. The air smelled faintly of rain and old dust. He found the spot easily, the ground still scarred from the dig site. Just a few yards away, near where the fence turned east, he saw a patch of earth that seemed slightly different. The grass was sparse there, the soil packed harder, as if something lay beneath. He crouched down, ran his fingers over the dirt, and felt the faint outline of something wooden just below the surface. For a long moment, he didn't move. The memory of the first discovery, the clang of the shovel, the white of bone against soil, flashed through his mind. He told himself not to touch it, to wait for the investigators. But the pull was too strong. He began to dig with his hands, slowly, carefully. The soil was dense, but gave way under pressure. After a few minutes, he uncovered what looked like a wooden plank, rotted and damp, nailed across something larger. He cleared more of the dirt away until the shape revealed itself, a hatch. His breath caught in his throat. The hinges were rusted, the edges eaten by time, but the wood was unmistakably part of a door. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, staring at it, unsure whether to open it or run. The air around him seemed to hum, the same low vibration he'd felt the day he found the bones. He didn't open it that night. He couldn't. Instead, he sat beside it until the first light of dawn, staring at the wooden surface as though expecting it to move. When the sun finally rose, turning the horizon gold, he stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. He knew what he had to do. He would call the sheriff, tell him what he'd found. But deep down, he already knew that whatever lay beneath that hatch wasn't just another secret. It was the heart of everything. The thing his grandfather had died protecting, the truth that had waited buried for half a century. As he walked back toward the house, the wind picked up behind him, rustling through the dry grass and making the old fence groan. It sounded almost like a voice, low and broken, whispering through the fields. He turned once, looked back at the spot, and for a moment thought he saw movement. The faint impression of a man's shadow beside the hatch, watching him go. When he reached the porch, the feeling was gone, but the certainty remained. The past wasn't finished speaking. And now, whether he was ready or not, Marcus would have to listen. The morning after Marcus discovered the wooden hatch, the light came slowly, filtered through a haze of dust that seemed to hang over the land like an omen. The air was still, heavy with the promise of heat. Marcus had slept barely an hour. He had sat most of the night by his window, staring out toward the northern fence line where the dark shape of that hidden door had glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind through the grass had sounded like movement beneath the soil. The image wouldn't leave his mind, the edge of the rotted wood, the way it seemed to hum faintly under his fingers, as if the ground itself held its breath. By sunrise, his decision was made. He drove into town before the day had fully broken, dust trailing behind his truck as it bounced over the rutted road. The sheriff's office sat quiet on Main Street, its windows reflecting the first light. He parked and went inside. The sheriff looked up from his desk when he entered, the lines on his face deepened by lack of sleep. He'd aged in the past week, the weight of the discovery hanging over him, too. Marcus told him everything. About the aerial photograph the investigators had shown him, about the spot he'd found the night before, about the hatch hidden beneath the dirt. The sheriff listened silently, his brow furrowed, fingers drumming lightly against the worn wood of his desk. When Marcus finished, there was a long pause. Finally, the sheriff exhaled and said, "We'll take a look." He reached for his phone, called in 2 deputies, and within the hour they were driving back toward the Hale Ranch. The sun was climbing by the time they arrived. The fields shimmered with heat, and the cicadas had begun their steady chorus. Marcus led them to the spot near the fence where the grass grew thin. The deputies worked quietly, digging around the edges of the hatch, clearing away the hardened soil. When they finally managed to pry it loose, the hinges groaned in protest, releasing a stale breath of air that smelled of rust and damp wood. The opening revealed a narrow shaft descending into darkness. A ladder, long decayed but still intact, led down into the earth. The sheriff shone his flashlight inside, the beam catching on the outline of stone walls and the faint glint of metal. He hesitated, then gestured to one of the deputies to go first. The man disappeared into the hole, the sound of his boots echoing dully. Moments later, his voice floated up. "You'd better come down here." Marcus followed last. The air was cool and still, thick with dust. The narrow chamber below was made of stone, the walls damp and streaked with mineral stains. Against one wall stood an iron cot, its frame rusted, a thin blanket still clinging to the springs. Nearby was a small table with the remains of a lantern and a half-empty bottle of water, so old the glass had clouded over. "We've confirmed it," he said as they stood on the porch, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. "The bones, the badge, the notes, it all lines up. Your grandfather was investigating the Whiteley family. He found proof they were forcing black families off their land. Maybe worse. The state's going to reopen some of those old missing persons cases." Marcus felt both vindicated and hollow. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about the enormity of what had been hidden. The sheriff hesitated before speaking again. "You should know, there's talk in town. Some folks think you're stirring up trouble, that you're trying to ruin reputations." Marcus nodded slowly. "Truth ruins nothing that deserves to stand," he said. The sheriff gave him a long, searching look, then nodded and left without another word. That night, the threats became more direct. Someone scrawled, "Let the dead lie," across his front gate in red paint. The next morning, he found his barn door ajar, one of his cows slaughtered, left in the dirt. He called the sheriff again, but there was nothing to be done. The investigation had reached a point where anger was spilling over. The Whiteleys had hired lawyers, their representatives flooding the news with statements denying any involvement. They called Joseph Hale a disgruntled officer who'd gone mad, obsessed with conspiracy. Marcus watched the interviews on television, his jaw tight, the old rage rising in him like heat from the dry ground. Days turned into weeks. The investigators gathered enough evidence to subpoena the Whiteley family records, uncovering a network of falsified deeds and payments made to officials in the 1970s. The picture that emerged was grim, an organized effort to strip land from those who couldn't defend it, all covered by the authority of local law enforcement. And standing against it, alone, had been Joseph Hale. Marcus thought often about what that must have cost his grandfather, the courage it took to stand up when everyone else was silent, and then the punishment for doing so. The grave in his own field was proof of that. But now, at least, the truth had surfaced. The cost would be his to bear, as it had been his grandfather's. Late one night, unable to sleep, Marcus walked out to the northern field. The moon was full, silver light spilling across the grass. The hatch remained open now, a piece of plywood placed over it for safety. He lifted it, shining his flashlight down into the darkness. The stone walls glistened faintly, the air cool and still. He climbed down slowly, his boots echoing on the rungs. Inside, he stood for a long time, staring at the empty cot, the table, the shadowed corners where his grandfather had once worked. The silence felt thick, expectant. He ran his fingers across the stone, tracing the grooves in the wall. In the beam of his flashlight, he noticed something faintly carved there, a single word, nearly erased by time. Truth. He stood there until dawn, the first light filtering down through the opening above. When he finally climbed out, he looked over the land. His land, his grandfather's land, and felt the shift that had been coming for weeks. The story was no longer buried. It had risen, and with it came reckoning. The town could whisper, the powerful could deny, but the earth had already spoken, and it never forgot. The wind picked up, rolling across the fields, carrying with it the scent of dust and rain. Marcus turned toward the house, feeling the old boards creak beneath his steps. Somewhere behind him, in that stretch of ground where his grandfather had been silenced, the land breathed again. The resistance had begun, not with violence, but with truth clawing its way through the roots of history, demanding to be seen. The first light of morning crept across the fields like a slow tide, touching the blades of grass and the weathered fence posts with gold. The wind was quiet, cautious, as though the land itself feared to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over the ranch. Marcus stood at the window of his kitchen, coffee cooling untouched in his hand, watching the horizon. The events of the past weeks had changed everything. The discovery of the bones, the letters, the ledger that had exposed the truth about what had happened to the people of this land. Yet, something inside him told him that what had been uncovered so far was not the end. The air still felt thick with secrets, the ground beneath him restless. He could feel it when he walked across the northern field, the way the soil seemed to breathe underfoot, as if something deep within it still waited to be found. He had gone down into the underground chamber several times since it was first discovered. The authorities had taken most of the papers, the notebooks, and the evidence, but Marcus couldn't stay away. He found himself drawn there night after night, carrying only a lantern and the photograph of his father as a boy. It had become a kind of ritual. He would sit on the edge of the cot where his grandfather had once rested, feeling the cool stone press through the fabric of his jeans, listening to the silence. Sometimes he thought he could hear faint sounds, the scrape of boots, the whisper of a man's voice, but he knew they were only tricks of memory, echoes of what once had been. That morning, the sheriff came by with more news. The case had reached national attention now. Journalists had started appearing in the county, their cars parked along the highway, their cameras turning toward Marcus's property. The Whiteley family had retreated behind their gates, refusing interviews, while their lawyers flooded the news with statements denouncing the accusations as fabricated stories built on the ambitions of a desperate man. Marcus felt the words burn like acid when he read them. He didn't care about ambition. He wanted truth. That was all his grandfather had wanted too, and for that, he'd been buried alive by silence. The sheriff's visit was short. He brought official documents confirming that more of the missing persons cases from the 70s had been tied to the same ring of corruption. It wasn't just land theft anymore. It was kidnapping, coercion, and murder. Marcus listened quietly as the sheriff explained that the FBI was taking over the investigation. "They'll want access to the property again," he said, rubbing his jaw. "They're going to start a deeper dig near that chamber, maybe see if there's more under there. Your grandfather might have built more than one room." After the sheriff left, Marcus sat for a long time at the table, staring at his untouched breakfast. The idea of there being more beneath the ranch stirred something deep in him. He remembered how the walls of the chamber had curved slightly on one side, as if the tunnel continued beyond what they'd seen. He thought it was just a structural quirk, but now it came back to him with a strange clarity. If there was more, then maybe his grandfather had left something else, something hidden beyond the reach of those who had killed him. That night, long after the lights of the investigators' vehicles had disappeared down the road, Marcus went out again. The air was warm and still, the kind of quiet that only comes before a storm. He carried his lantern and a small shovel, walking across the field until he reached the hatch. The plywood cover was gone. The agents had left it open after their last inspection. He climbed down the ladder slowly, his boots finding the familiar rhythm of the rungs. The air inside was cool, thick with the scent of damp stone and age. He lit the lantern and placed it on the table. The light flickered across the walls, revealing the carvings and scratches his grandfather had left. He moved closer to the far wall, running his fingers along the surface. The faint word "truth" was still there, but beside it, barely visible, was something else, an indentation, small but deliberate. He pressed his hand against it and felt a subtle give, as though the stone shifted slightly under pressure. He pushed harder. The wall groaned softly, and then a thin crack appeared along its edge, sending a puff of dust into the air. Marcus stepped back, heart pounding. The crack widened with a low rumble, and a section of the wall swung inward. Behind it was a narrow tunnel, swallowed by darkness. He hesitated only a moment before picking up the lantern and stepping through. The air grew colder as he descended. The passage was low, forcing him to crouch, the floor uneven and littered with bits of debris. The walls were lined with old wooden beams, blackened by moisture but still holding. The deeper he went, the stronger the smell of earth became, heavy and ancient. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. It was barely larger than a closet, but the sight that met his eyes made him freeze. Against one wall was a pile of wooden crates, covered with a layer of burlap that crumbled to dust when he touched it. Inside the first crate, beneath old newspapers and straw, were objects wrapped carefully in cloth. He unrolled one. Inside lay a revolver, its metal dull with age. Another crate held boxes of ammunition, cans of dried food, and medical supplies stamped with army markings from the 1940s. This was no random hiding place. It was a refuge. He turned slowly, scanning the room. In the far corner, a small trunk sat half buried in dirt. He pulled it free and opened it. Inside were papers again, but these were different from the others. They were older, written in fading ink, some brittle and torn. The top sheet bore the words "Safe Routes" and a series of lines that looked like a hand-drawn map. Marcus's breath caught as he realized what he was looking at. These weren't just notes from his grandfather's investigation. They were records from much earlier, perhaps passed down through generations. His grandfather had found them, preserved them, hidden them here. The lines on the map weren't roads, they were tunnels, routes that stretched beyond his land, possibly connecting to others. It struck him all at once. This wasn't just his grandfather's hideout. It was a remnant of the Underground Railroad. His family's land had been part of it, a secret refuge for those fleeing north in the time of slavery. The chamber his grandfather used had once sheltered men, women, and children escaping bondage. The carved word on the wall, truth, took on a new meaning. Joseph Hale had known this history. He had protected it, preserved it, and perhaps died for it. Marcus sank to his knees, the weight of it pressing down on him like the earth above. He thought of all the nights his grandfather must have spent here, riding by lamplight, documenting the wrongs committed in their county, carrying the legacy of those who had hidden beneath the same soil generations before. The same courage, the same defiance had run through their blood. He gathered a few of the papers and carried them back to the surface. The night sky greeted him with a sheet of distant lightning flashing along the horizon. The wind had begun to rise, carrying the smell of rain. He stood there for a long time, the lantern's glow flickering against his face, the documents fluttering in his hands. The world felt both vast and intimate, as though all of history were whispering through the wind. The next morning, he contacted the sheriff again. Within hours, the field was swarming with agents and historians, their voices sharp with excitement. They confirmed what Marcus had suspected. The structure was authentic, a part of a network of safe houses and tunnels that stretched across several states. His land had been more than a ranch. It had been a sanctuary. The discovery rewrote not only his family's history, but the town's. It forced everyone to confront a past that had been buried just as deep as his grandfather's bones. But with revelation came resistance. Some of the townspeople called it propaganda, an attempt to tarnish their heritage. Others claimed it was coincidence, that Marcus was exaggerating. There were even whispers that he had planted the documents himself. The pressure mounted. Reporters camped outside his gate, their cameras trained on his house. Neighbors who once waved at him now crossed the street to avoid his gaze. Despite the noise, Marcus felt a strange peace. The truth was out there now, undeniable and alive. The land had given up its secrets piece by piece, and he had simply been the one chosen to hear them. He spent the following evenings walking through the fields, the grass whispering around his boots. The rain had finally come, soft at first, then steady, washing away the dust and leaving the earth dark and alive again. He took it as a sign, a kind of baptism, cleansing the land of all it had carried. On one of those nights, as thunder rolled in the distance, Marcus stood by the northern fence and looked toward the horizon. The faint outline of the town lights flickered miles away, but out here, the world felt endless. He thought of his grandfather's final days, the loneliness he must have felt knowing that the truth he'd uncovered would die with him. And yet, somehow it hadn't. The land had remembered. It had waited until the time was right, until someone strong enough came along to dig deep enough to listen. He whispered a quiet thank you into the wind, unsure whether it was to his grandfather or to the earth itself. Perhaps they were the same. The rain began to fall harder, drumming softly on his hat, sliding down his face. He smiled, the lantern's light dancing in his eyes. For the first time in years, the land didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt alive, awake, as if it, too, had been freed from silence. As he turned back toward the house, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the fields, the fence line, and, for a fleeting moment, the old oak tree that stood near the tunnel's entrance. Beneath it, the ground seemed to shimmer, a glint of wet stone barely visible through the grass. Marcus paused. He didn't need to dig again to know what it meant. There would always be more to find, more stories waiting under the soil. But tonight, it was enough to know that he had found what mattered most. His family's truth was no longer buried. The past had spoken, and the living had finally listened. The rain that had swept across the plains the night before left behind a quiet, heavy stillness. The soil around the Hale Ranch was dark and damp, gleaming faintly under the pale light of dawn. The air smelled of renewal, wet earth, cedar, and something electric that lingered after the storm. Marcus stood on the porch, watching a thin mist drift low across the fields, clinging to the fence posts like ghosts reluctant to let go. The world looked softer now, but beneath that calm he could feel something shifting, a pressure that had been building for weeks and was now beginning to break the surface. The truth had risen from the ground, and it was spreading. Within days of the discovery of the underground tunnel, the entire county became a storm of attention. Cars and news vans crowded the road outside his property, their tires sinking into the mud left by the rain. Reporters leaned against the hoods of their vehicles, microphones ready, cameras pointed toward the ranch that had suddenly become a symbol of something larger than any one family. Marcus avoided them as best he could, driving into town before dawn or after dark, keeping his head down. But even then, he could feel the weight of their eyes on him and the way people whispered when he passed. The state investigators returned first, followed by a team from the FBI. They arrived in unmarked cars, their presence quieter but no less significant. The sheriff came with them, his expression grim but respectful, as though he understood that what was happening now was beyond the scale of his small department. The federal agents spoke little at first, preferring to let the evidence speak for itself. They brought equipment, scanners, cameras, boxes of tools, and began mapping the underground structures in detail. Marcus watched from a distance as they worked. They discovered that the tunnel extended farther than anyone had imagined, connecting to two other hidden chambers under the far side of the property. Each room told a piece of the story: remnants of supplies, carved symbols on the walls, fragments of old clothing. Historians confirmed what Marcus had already come to believe. The land had been part of the Underground Railroad, a sanctuary that had helped dozens of enslaved people find freedom generations before Joseph Hale was ever born. But that wasn't all the investigators found. In one of the newly uncovered chambers, sealed behind a brick wall, they discovered a metal strongbox. Inside were more notebooks, letters, and a stack of faded photographs. The papers were brittle, the ink blurred, but the meaning was unmistakable. They contained records of the deals struck between the Whiteley family and several local officials, documents that proved beyond question that land had been stolen through fraud, intimidation, and murder. There were names, dates, bank statements, and at the bottom of the box, wrapped in waxed paper, was a single page written in Joseph Hale's steady, deliberate hand. It read, "If you find this, it means they never silenced me. The truth cannot be buried forever. This land remembers." When the sheriff handed the letter to Marcus, he couldn't speak. He read it again and again until the words blurred, the paper trembling in his hands. The simple sentence felt like a voice carried through time, as if his grandfather were standing beside him, speaking directly into his ear. The discovery sent shockwaves through the state. News outlets across the country began running the story. Headlines about the sheriff who died for the truth, about the network of corruption that had hidden beneath the surface of a quiet Texas county. The Whiteley family, long considered untouchable, suddenly found themselves at the center of a criminal investigation. Federal agents raided their estate. seizing records and property deeds that confirmed the accusations Joseph Hale had died for. For Marcus, it was surreal to watch it all unfold. He saw the televised reports, the headlines that used his grandfather's name as if he were a legend, but he couldn't find comfort in any of it. The justice that came now was too late for those who had suffered. The land that his grandfather had died to defend had been stained for half a century before anyone had cared to notice. Every interview, every headline, every documentary that followed seemed to feed the same hunger, to turn tragedy into spectacle. Marcus refused every request for comment. He stayed on the ranch, tending to his cattle, repairing the barn roof, and walking the fence line as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The backlash came quickly. For every voice that praised Joseph Hale's bravery, there were others that called him a liar, a traitor, a man who had betrayed his own community by accusing respected families of crimes. The Whiteley lawyers released statements denying all wrongdoing, insisting that the documents were forgeries planted by individuals seeking attention. Local talk radio hosts picked up the rhetoric, painting Marcus as an opportunist who had dug up ghosts for fame. It hurt, though he tried not to show it. The threats started again. Anonymous letters in his mailbox, messages scrawled on his gate. Someone fired a gun one night in the distance, the crack echoing across the field. He found the shell casing near his fence the next morning. The sheriff offered to post a patrol near the ranch, but Marcus refused. He had no intention of letting fear drive him from the land his grandfather had died to protect. Days blurred into weeks. The rain came and went, the grass grew tall again, and the scars on the earth where the tunnels had been uncovered slowly began to fade. But Marcus could still feel the shift in the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The investigation continued quietly, though he heard little of it. The agents called occasionally to ask questions, but their tone was formal, distant. The world's attention had already begun to move on. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields glowed with that strange golden light that comes only at the edge of day, a car turned up the long dirt road to the ranch. It was Agent Carter, the same man who had first taken charge of the federal investigation weeks earlier. Marcus met him on the porch, where the agent removed his hat and looked out across the land for a long moment before speaking. "It's over," he said simply. "The case is closed." Marcus waited. Carter continued, his tone steady. The federal government had officially seized the Whiteley estate and several other properties connected to the scandal. The surviving members of the family were under indictment for conspiracy, obstruction, and fraud. Dozens of other names from the documents, officials, businessmen, even law enforcement officers were being charged or investigated. The case would take years to fully resolve, but the truth had been established beyond doubt. Carter paused, glancing down at his hands. "I know this doesn't fix what happened," he said quietly, "but your grandfather's work mattered. He gave us a trail that no one else could have found. What you uncovered finished what he started." Marcus nodded but said nothing. The weight of those words felt both comforting and unbearable. Carter lingered for a while, drinking coffee on the porch, both men silent as the sun sank below the horizon. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and handed Marcus a small envelope. Inside was an official letter from Washington, a certificate of recognition for Joseph Hale's service and sacrifice. The seal gleamed faintly in the fading light. Marcus stared at it for a long time after Carter drove away, the paper soft in his hands. He didn't hang it on the wall. Instead, he placed it in the drawer beside the old photograph of his father where it belonged, with the things that truly mattered. As summer turned to autumn, the noise of the outside world faded. The reporters left, the road grew quiet again, and the grass reclaimed the paths where the investigators' trucks had once parked. The land seemed to breathe easier. Marcus spent his days mending fences, clearing debris, and planting wildflowers along the edge of the property. Sometimes, as he worked, he would feel the faint tremor of the ground beneath his boots, the living heartbeat of the land. In town, the change was slower. Some people still avoided him, their eyes hard with resentment, but others began to come around, quietly, cautiously. An elderly woman stopped by one afternoon, her hands trembling as she handed him a faded letter. It had been written by her father, one of the men whose land had been stolen in the 70s. "Your grandfather tried to help us," she said softly. "We never forgot that." There were more visits after that, descendants of those whose names had appeared in Joseph Hale's notes, people who had once been too afraid to speak. They came not to stir the past, but to thank him. To them, Marcus wasn't a symbol or a headline. He was simply the man who had listened to the land when it finally spoke. And yet, even in peace, the past lingered. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, Marcus would walk out to the northern fence line where it had all begun. The soil there had been filled in again, grass growing over the scar. He would stand for a while, watching the sky darken, listening to the wind as it whispered through the fields. It sounded different now, not mournful, but calm, as if the land itself had finally been allowed to rest. One night, he knelt and placed his hand on the ground, feeling the cool, damp earth beneath his palm. "You were right, Grandpa," he murmured. "The land remembers." As the stars rose above the plains, he thought of how far the truth had traveled, from a hidden chamber beneath his feet to the halls of power where men once conspired to bury it. And yet, despite everything, it had found its way back home. Justice had not come easily, nor had it come soon enough, but it had come. The cycle of silence had been broken, and the earth that had once concealed the past now carried it openly, honestly, like a scar that no longer needed hiding. Marcus stayed there until the moon climbed high, the fields silver in its glow. For the first time since the day he struck the shovel against that buried truth, he felt something close to peace. The land had spoken its last word, and he had heard it clearly. The rest of the world could move on, forget, distort, but here, on this patch of soil where generations of his family had lived, fought, and died, the truth would remain. It was written into the ground itself, unerasable, eternal. When he finally rose and walked back toward the house, the night air was cool against his skin. The door creaked softly as he stepped inside, the warmth of the old home wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. He glanced once more out the window before turning off the light. The horizon stretched endlessly under the stars, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain. The land slept at peace, and so did he. Winter came softly that year, creeping across the Texas plains like a whisper rather than a storm. The mornings grew cold and silver, the frost tracing delicate patterns along the window panes of the old Hale farmhouse. The fields that had once been scarred by excavation were now covered in pale grass that shimmered in the early light, bending gently under the wind. Marcus rose before dawn each day, lighting the old stove and pouring himself a cup of coffee before stepping out onto the porch. The air was crisp, his breath visible in short clouds, and the horizon stretched endlessly ahead, quiet and unbroken. For the first time in a long while, the ranch felt still, like the land itself had settled after years of unrest. Months had passed since the investigation had ended, since the media had left and the world had moved on. The county had grown quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This was a living kind of quiet, full of space for breath and memory. The truth had taken root in the soil, and now it rested there like an old tree whose roots ran deep. The people who once avoided him in town had begun to nod again when they passed. Some stopped to talk, cautious but genuine, asking about the ranch, about the weather, about the changes that had come since everything had been revealed. It was as if the land itself had forced everyone to face what they had buried, and though not everyone was ready to speak of it, the denial had begun to fade. Marcus had found a rhythm again. He repaired the barn roof before the first snow, replaced the fence posts along the eastern border, and cleared the overgrown paths leading to the creek bed that had been dry for years. The rains that had come in the summer had filled it again, just enough to leave a slow, steady trickle through the reeds. He'd walk there some evenings, his boots sinking into the damp ground, the sound of water soft beneath the wind. It reminded him that life, even after drought, had a way of returning. The land always healed itself, given enough time and care. One afternoon, he received a letter from the Historical Society in Austin. They had finished cataloging the documents found on his property, the journals, letters, and maps, and were creating an archive dedicated to Joseph Hale and the history of the Underground Railroad in the American Southwest. They wanted Marcus to attend the unveiling of the exhibit. He read the letter twice before setting it aside. He wasn't a man for ceremonies or speeches, and the thought of standing in front of cameras again made his stomach twist. But as he looked out across the land that had carried his family for generations, he realized the invitation wasn't about him. It was about honoring what his grandfather had given and what the land had finally returned. When the day came, he dressed simply in a clean shirt, his old hat, and a jacket that had belonged to his father. The drive to Austin took half the day, the road cutting through the wide-open plains that seemed to stretch forever. At the museum, people shook his hand, thanked him for his honesty, spoke about courage and justice. He listened quietly, saying little. When they unveiled the display, he felt something stir deep inside. Behind the glass lay his grandfather's notebook, opened to the page that began, "The truth cannot be buried forever." Beside it was the badge that had once been pulled from the earth, polished now, its metal gleaming under the lights. After the event ended and the crowd dispersed, Marcus stayed behind. The curator, a woman with kind eyes, told him he could have a moment alone in the room. He stood before the display in silence, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. He thought of his grandfather, of the man who had stood against the tide of his time, who had died believing his work would never be seen. "They see it now," Marcus whispered. "They finally see." For the first time since the day he'd uncovered the bones, he felt the heaviness in his chest ease. It wasn't gone, but it had changed, softened into something closer to pride. He returned to the ranch that night under a sky full of stars. The road was dark and empty, the headlights of his truck sweeping over the land like a slow wave. When he arrived, the house waited for him in silence, the porch light glowing faintly in the distance. He parked, stepped out, and inhaled deeply. The cold air filled his lungs, sharp and clear. Above him, the constellations glittered like scattered fragments of silver. It struck him then how timeless it all felt, how the land had watched generations live and die, carrying their joys and their sins alike, until truth finally found its way back to the surface. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to work on something new. With help from a few neighbors and volunteers from the Historical Society, he restored the underground chamber where his grandfather's journals had been found. The tunnels were cleaned and reinforced, the walls stabilized. What had once been a place of danger and secrecy became a place of memory. He decided to open it as a small memorial, not for profit, but for remembrance. A local carpenter helped him build a simple wooden sign near the entrance. It read, "Path of the Living Truth." He didn't want anything grand, just a quiet space where people could come and feel the weight of history under their feet. The opening was small. A few dozen people gathered at the ranch, among them the sheriff, the woman from the museum, and several families whose ancestors had once lived and labored in the county. There were prayers, a few short speeches, and then a long, reverent silence. Marcus watched them descend into the tunnel one by one, their lanterns flickering like fireflies in the dark. When the last of them emerged, many were crying quietly, their faces touched by something he couldn't name. They thanked him, and he nodded, his throat too tight for words. As the crowd drifted away and the last car disappeared down the road, Marcus remained by the entrance, the sign creaking softly in the wind. The sun was setting, painting the sky in broad strokes of orange and violet. He thought of all that had happened, the discovery, the chaos, the pain, and of how the land had endured it all, silent and patient. He realized that, in its own way, the land had been waiting for him, just as his grandfather had waited for someone to carry on his work. He had been chosen not by fate or blood alone, but by the simple act of listening when others refused to. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the nights longer. The cattle huddled close in the barns, their breath steaming in the cold air. Marcus kept busy repairing tools, mending walls, clearing snow from the path to the memorial. Sometimes visitors still came, historians, students, travelers passing through. He welcomed them all, offering coffee, stories, and silence in equal measure. They always left with the same look in their eyes, a quiet awe, as if they'd seen something sacred hidden beneath the surface of the world. One evening, as the first hints of spring began to show in the thawing earth, Marcus received a small package in the mail. Inside was a wooden plaque carved by one of the volunteers from the restoration. It bore 3 simple words, "You found peace." He smiled when he saw it, the corners of his eyes crinkling. The phrase felt familiar, like something he had been waiting his whole life to hear. He hung it by the gate at the edge of his property, where everyone entering could see it. When the wind blew, the sign swayed gently, its faint creak blending with the rustle of grass. The years ahead were quieter. The ranch continued, smaller now but thriving in its own way. Marcus took in a few strays, an injured horse, 2 orphaned calves, and cared for them as if they'd always belonged. He spent his evenings on the porch, sometimes reading from his grandfather's journals, sometimes simply listening to the chorus of crickets and wind. He no longer felt alone. The land around him was alive with memory, each gust of wind carrying whispers of all those who had walked it before. As time passed, the story of Joseph Hale became part of local history. Schools taught it, museums recorded it, and travelers from across the country came to see the tunnels and the fields where the truth had once slept. But for Marcus, the greatest legacy wasn't in the books or the headlines. It was in the quiet peace that had returned to the land itself. The earth no longer felt heavy. It breathed freely now, its burdens lifted. And though his days followed the same steady rhythm they always had, he knew that something in the heart of the world had changed. On the anniversary of the day he'd found the buried bones, Marcus walked out to the northern field alone. The grass there was tall again, swaying gently under the soft wind. He knelt, pressing his hand into the soil, the earth cool and firm beneath his palm. "It's done now," he whispered. "You can rest." The wind rose, carrying the faint scent of rain and mesquite, and for a moment he thought he heard an answer, a low hum that seemed to come from the ground itself, deep and contented. He stood, the sky wide and endless above him. The sun was setting again, spilling gold across the plains, and the fields glowed like embers. As he turned back toward the house, he felt the familiar ache of years behind him, but also the deep calm of a man who had fulfilled what was asked of him. The past no longer reached for him. It had been laid to rest, honored and understood. When he reached the porch, he paused to look back one last time. The horizon stretched far and open, the land unbroken and whole. The wind moved gently across it, like the breath of someone finally at peace. Marcus smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and whispered to the land that had given him everything, "Thank you." That night, as he sat by the fire, the house warm around him, he thought of his grandfather's final words. The truth cannot be buried forever, and understood their deeper meaning. It wasn't only about what had been uncovered, but about what endured after. Truth, like the land, never died. It waited patiently beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig. Outside, the stars burned bright and steady. The wind rustled softly through the fields, carrying with it the voices of those who had come before. And in that quiet, infinite night, the Hale Ranch slept, no longer burdened by secrets, but held gently by peace. Peace earned, peace deserved, and peace returned to the land. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next incredible true story. Turn on notifications and watch our upcoming videos, each one more unbelievable than the last. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends. Let the world know that some truths can't stay buried forever.